get started. I'm Marcy Winograd. I'm the coordinator of CODEPINK Congress. I co-host many of our CODEPINK Congress sessions with Medea Benjamin. I'm so proud to have us co-host tonight, and a number of our Zooms with Massachusetts Peace Action. Cole Harrison, the executive director, will be with us.
Hey, Marcy.
Well. Hi.
So sorry, just to pause you really quick. Can you make me host again so I can stream this?
Oh, sure. Okay.
Sorry, everyone.
There we go.
Thank you.
All right. So yeah, Cole Harrison is with us from Massachusetts Peace Action, as is Amar Ahmad, who is the staff support for the No Cold War Working Group for Massachusetts Peace Action. So tonight we have two terrific guests, Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff to former Secretary of State Colin Powell and is now a critic of U.S. foreign policy and militarism. And we also have Reiner Braun, who will be joining us from Europe, who is the head of the International Peace Bureau and very active in the No to NATO network. And Cole is, in a minute, going to introduce another guest who will speak just for a few minutes, an intern, a Russian intern with Massachusetts Peace Action. But for now, let's go to our updates. Cole. Oh, before I do that, excuse me, I just want to point out that Shay will be posting, if she hasn't already done so, in the chat, our CODEPINK statement on Ukraine, which is, in short, Russian troops out, no to NATO expansion, negotiations, not escalation, no negotiations without preconditions, and no weapons, no more weapons to militarize this conflict. And we do not want to see blanket sanctions that only harm the Russian people. We want to stand in solidarity with both the Ukrainians under attack. We condemn this invasion in the strongest of terms, and we want to stand in solidarity with the Russians and all the Europeans who are marching in the streets opposing this war, this invasion, this attack. Cole, tell us about Massachusetts Peace Action.
Actually, Amar is going to introduce us from MAPA. Amar Ahmed, go ahead.
Thank you, Cole. And thank you, Marcy and CODEPINK. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us tonight. We are all deeply concerned by this war, by human suffering, and by loss of human life. We hope for peace and diplomacy. Massachusetts Peace Action has also just put out our full statement, which our executive director, Cole Harrison, will share in the chat. At Massachusetts Peace Action, we're all processing these events in our own ways. And all of us are deeply concerned and worried. We urge our members of Congress to not escalate the war by sending weapons into this region, into Ukraine or Eastern Europe, and by imposing sanctions on Russia, which will harm ordinary citizens. We are joining a coalition for an International Day of Action on Sunday, March 6th, to say yes to peace and no to war. If you're in the Boston area, please come and join us at 1 p.m. at the steps of the Massachusetts State House. We understand there's a very complex historical context to current events, so we have organized and engaged in events of public education, such as what we're doing tonight. So everyone, again, thank you so much. And with that, I'll pass it to Cole to introduce Elizaveta.
Yeah, Elizaveta Koprianova is a Northeastern University undergraduate, and she's a Russian national from Moscow and an intern with Mass Peace Action this spring. So I want to introduce Elizaveta to give us her perspective on the situation.
Hi, everyone. And I just wanted to start by saying that this situation is unacceptable at any level in the 21st century. And yes, I'm a Russian citizen, but I'm also a regular person, just like any of you. So I don't have the full information in order to have a concrete position. Therefore, I don't want and don't have one at the moment. But all I want to say is that I'm very saddened and devastated to see that this is the way the world approaches and handles conflicts in the 21st century. We're living in a modern developed world where diplomacy and negotiation should be used as a resolution and not arms and bloodshed. Negotiations and talks are already happening and taking place, and we should be supporting and pushing them forward. Also, I think it's crucial to add for me that not all Russians are responsible for what the government does. And in fact, the majority of us are for peace and against war. But at the same time, people in Russia are threatened by even saying no war because this is seen as betrayal to the motherland. And you can be sentenced for 20 years to prison. And today, an hour ago, I learned that even kids from age 7 to 11 have been put in cells for overnight just because they came out with posters, no war. Also, I have many Ukrainian friends, and we are utterly worried about the conflict and taking any steps we can to be a part of the resolution. Even if the war ends tomorrow, the consequences of it will still take decades to normalize. So everyone in Russia understands that young people around the world are now taking and will later have to take the most sincere and active part in resolving the consequences and normalization of relations between Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of the world. So all I want to say is that right now, diplomacy and negotiations is the path towards the resolution.
Thank you so much, Elizaveta. It means a lot to us, to hear from you, and that's really tragic about the silencing of the anti-war voices in Russia. Before we get started with our program, I would like to go to Medea now for an update also on Ukraine and Afghanistan.
Well, really, I think in terms of Afghanistan, unfortunately, the emphasis and the momentum we had to start unfreezing those assets, the over $7 billion that the US is holding, has been so overshadowed by the Ukraine tragedy. I also have learned that the money that the UN has asked in an emergency appeal for $5 billion for Afghanistan humanitarian aid, many countries are now switching that to go to Ukraine refugees. And so once again, it's Afghan people who are suffering from all kinds of things that go on in the world that are not of their own making. In terms of Ukraine, I'm going to put in the chat the new website that we have created, where you can go to see if there is an event being organized in your area for this Sunday, March 6th, or you can post one there. We just put it up today, so events are really streaming in now. So check it every day, and there should be a lot more coming on board. We're excited to be working with our friends in Europe, the Stop the War Coalition UK, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK, and the No to NATO network as we build up this global movement to stop this war. And with that, Marcy, should I go ahead and introduce Reiner?
Before Reiner, and we are looking forward to hearing from him, Cole was going to update us on the Yemen War Powers Resolution.
Yeah, just to say a word on that is that, it's day 6 of Russia's unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine, and over 600 have died. But it's day 2,555 of the US-Saudi UAE war on Yemen, and 377,000 have died or been starved as a result of the war in Yemen. And yet there's no discussion of it on the media. Most Americans don't even know where Yemen is, don't even know that we're at war in Yemen. So it's an unacceptable situation. It's racist. It's been commented by several commentators that even though the situation in Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable, the extreme attention being given to it and the extreme ignorance of the many other wars started by the US, it reflects a racial bias. And so anyway, it's going to be the 7th anniversary of the start of the war in 2 weeks. And so today there were nationwide rallies in a number of cities calling on Congress to pass a war powers resolution to end the war in Yemen. Congress did that 3 years ago. Both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, passed a war powers resolution, the first time one has ever passed by the Congress, telling President Trump to cut off support for the Saudi UAE war in Yemen. Trump vetoed it, so the war did not end. And Biden, on his campaign trail, said he was going to end the war in Yemen. Well, he hasn't ended it. He's doubled down on it and escalated it further. So it's time for another war powers resolution. So we need to ask for Congress to introduce those resolutions in both houses. You know, a war powers resolution has to be brought to a vote. So once it's introduced, there will be a vote in the House and hopefully also in the Senate, if we can get one brave senator to introduce that resolution. So that's what's going on with the Yemen war.
Thank you so much. Cole Harrison with Massachusetts Peace Action, Executive Director. And I hear that Congressman DeFazio is expected to introduce that war powers resolution on Yemen in March. Well, here we are in March, but our attention is turned elsewhere and we understand why. Medea, go ahead, please introduce our guest who's coming to us. I think it's 2 a.m. in Europe.
Yes, I'm really delighted to introduce a good friend of mine, Reiner Braun, who is a German journalist, historian, a peace activist. He has worked for or been the director of a number of wonderful organizations, including Scientists for Peace and Sustainability, the International Network of Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, the German Pugwash Group, and now he is the co-president of the International Peace Bureau. He's also the author of several books, including Einstein in Peace, and I have had the privilege of working with him in numerous campaigns, such as the campaign against the US Air Base in Ramstein, the campaign against killer drones, and the No to NATO campaign. It is over past 2 a.m. in Berlin right now, so we are really, really so honored that you have stayed up till very late to join us tonight. We have over close to 400 people joining in this call, and we're really anxious to hear from you, Reiner. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea. Thank you, dear colleagues and dear friends. Good morning. And it's really a pleasure to be with you in these horrible times. You know, the war is for us around the corner. And it is absolutely needed to say first, there is no reason for this aggression of Russia against Ukraine. We condemn deeply the war against Ukraine and our solidarity with the people in Ukraine, but our solidarity is also with the people in Russia which are fighting against the war. And it is great to say and to see that thousands of Russian people are going on the streets under very repressive conditions. For the first time yesterday, we had a protest manifestation in front of the Lomonosov University by students of this university. We had many, many people in many cities of Russia which are going on the street, like in our country. We had more than 100,000 on the streets in Berlin last Sunday, and we are preparing with you the protest action next week. We have protest action days in Germany and in many cities and countries of Europe. And this is absolutely necessary. Let me say it in one word sentence. The period, the 30 years period after the Cold War is over. We are coming now in a new period of a very aggressive politics. And definitely it is absolutely needed to condemn the Russian aggression. But it's also necessary to say the conditions that this aggression happened was developed by the Western countries, above all by NATO. The NATO enlargement, the NATO expansion to the east, and not to take care of Russian security interests is a main reason for this war. And NATO is now using the chance not only to become even stronger than as the military alliance of the world, but start with a dramatic, intensive new arms race. And my country, Germany, is definitely in the forefront. We never had an enlargement of the military budget than it will be in the next year. We have a special fund now for 100 billion US, 100 billion euro we never had, and the enlargement of the weight of the military budget from 1.25% to more than 2%. This means instead of 50 billion every year, we will spend 80 billion. And that's in such a situation where the poorest in the world become more poor and where the climate crisis is absolutely not solved. We all were listening to the new IPCC report, which dramatically underline in which big danger the world is. And when I'm looking to these conditions, I can only say the way of armament race, the way of wars is the wrong way. And let me underline that we are opposing these wars and are fighting on the street. But we are also absolutely against these double standards, our official politics and our governments. The governments say, okay, we want a peace in Ukraine, and they are doing wars all around the world. I'm happy that you mentioned Afghanistan and Yemen. And I'm happy, we need to say these politics of double standards, condemning these wars and preparing all the other wars in the world, in Africa and Asia and other countries, even in Central Europe. These are really double standards. And we said no to these double standards. We want peace. So we are strongly against more weapons to the Ukraine. We are strongly against sanctions, because sanctions are against the poor people. Poor people and the normal people are suffering by sanctions. So what is needed is a peace process. First of all, stop the war, ceasefire, and reduction of the Russian troops. But we need in Europe, and I think not only in Europe, a new politics of common security as the alternative of war and arms race. Common security means I'm only secure, I'm only safe when my partner is also safe. We have to work together. Security is, you can only get security in a double pack, your security and the security of your neighbor. And that is the alternative to this brutal war in Ukraine, but also for the alternative for the arms race and for further NATO expansion, which will lead us to more wars. So my call tonight is, please go on the street, protest against the war. Let us unite in a worldwide peace movement for peace and disarmament, for common security, and to stop this brutal war in the Ukraine. Peace is the alternative. And to follow with the last sentence of the German Nobel Peace laureate Willy Brandt, he said in his famous speech when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, war is the top of irrationality. Rational is only peace. Let us fight for peace, and thank you so much for the invitation tonight.
Thank you so much, Reiner Braun, coming to us at 2 a.m. in the morning in Europe to say no more war, no more weapons. We need an international, a European, regional security agreement that will address the stakeholders that are involved and ensure their safety and security. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll stay on. We're going to have a Q&A. And I just want to let everybody know we have, well, almost 400 people on the call right now, that we will be taking action during this call after we hear from our next speaker. So I believe, Cole, you're going to introduce our next speaker.
Okay, right. So I want to welcome Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He is an adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. And he was the former chief of staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell from 2002 to 2005. Larry.
Let me say thank you to everyone here, Herr Braun, Massachusetts Peace Action, CODEPINK. And let me say also that when I was listening to the objectives that were being expressed, I was thinking those are all the right objectives. Couldn't say that I disagree with a single one of them, but they're not realistic. And that's the problem. That's the huge problem. And let me just cite some history here for a moment. And I know everyone probably is familiar with this history, but they might not be familiar with the aspects of it that I'm going to point out. One is that one of the people who knew Russia probably as well as anyone in the world, certainly anyone from North America, from the United States. George Kennan, famous for the long telegram from Moscow that sort of commenced the US posture in the Cold War. But Kennan would say many times later that we didn't do all the things that he recommended we do. His essential point was all we had to do was be ourselves and demonstrate to the world who we were and why we were who we were, and Russia would collapse eventually. Well, in his really advanced years, I think he was about 98 or 99 when he came to visit Secretary Powell at that time. He wanted Powell to know that one of the things that was probably the greatest strategic era, in fact, he called it that, the greatest strategic era at the beginning of the 21st century was the expansion of NATO. And he essentially predicted what is happening today, what happened with Georgia, what is happening now with Ukraine, and what's been happening for some time since the wild abandon of the United States and its NATO partners took NATO into 30 countries. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, what Article 5 means with regard to 30 countries. Imagine if I were to go out to, let's say, somewhere in West Texas and find me a cattle rancher and say, do you know where Montenegro is? The first thing he would probably say is, after he laughed, no, where is it? And I would tell him where it was. And I would then acquaint him with the fact that he is willing to risk nuclear war to defend Montenegro. And I'd ask him how he felt about that. Well, I can guarantee you he wouldn't feel too content about it. And yet that's what we've done. And at the same time we did that, we made Article 5 itself a ridiculous consideration when in fact it was probably the most important part of the political and the military alliance, by going into out-of-area operations, everything from Libya to Syria to Afghanistan and so forth. How is that an Article 5 political or military alliance? And then the second thing I'd bring to your attention is what was said by both the head of delegation for Russia and the head of delegation for Ukraine as the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose report came out on the 28th, as was previously mentioned, what they said in respect to this conflict. The head of Ukrainian delegation essentially said, we should be working on reducing fossil fuels, which is what this conflict is all about. She had a point there. Don't have time to go into it, but she had a point there. And the head of Russian delegation condemned the invasion. He condemned his own leader, Vladimir Putin. I don't know what's going to happen to him when he gets back to Moscow, but those were brave remarks coming from these two people, but they were remarks that are, unlike what I was saying before about unreality, they were remarks that face a stark reality. And that is, if you look at the technical section of that report, even in the summary, which has to be approved by every nation, but the technical section in the body of the report tells you the real nitty gritty. If you look at that section, you can conclude that you do not want to live in a 1.5 degree world. You probably can't live in a 2 degree world, and we are very likely headed for a 3 or 4 degree world. That's the end of life on this planet as we know it, and we're doing these things like invading Ukraine, or in the case of the United States, fomenting a coup in 2014 and having its CIA support neo-Nazis inside Ukraine as one of their arms, so to speak, and all manner of other dastardly deeds when we should be looking at the two really serious threats in the world today. One staring us in the face since the United States abandoned the ABM Treaty, abandoned the Open Skies Treaty, abandoned the INF Treaty, and was about to abandon START too, until Vladimir Putin said, no, let's probably keep that one, and we managed to keep that one. Nuclear weapons. We have a new lease on life for nuclear weapons. I'm waiting eagerly to see President Biden's nuclear posture review because he promised to take some of this life out of the renewal of nuclear weapons and their tactical utility on the battlefield. I'm not sure he's going to do it. I hope this Ukraine crisis doesn't motivate him to not do it. But at any rate, even if he does do what he said he's going to do, we're still way behind the power curve on nuclear weapons. And there is big a threat in the looking us right in the face as the climate crisis. But ultimately, the climate crisis is going to make even them not mean a thing, because we are going to be like the dinosaurs. We're not going to be here anymore. The Earth will go on. It'll have no problem. It'll go another 4.5, maybe 5 billion years before it burns out in the sun, but we won't be on it. And that's the truth. And I'm glad to see that we finally have a report that begins to go into the kind of detail necessary to get people's attentions. My question is, will it get their attention? It certainly won't get their attention, as the two heads of delegation at the IPCC, one for Ukraine, one for Russia, made a point of, if we keep having these distractors. It's tragic what's going on in Ukraine, but it's a transient event. It is an event that shouldn't have happened, and it's an event that's distracting the world from the things it should be doing. The kind of cooperation, the kind of comity, the kind of peace, as Herr Braun said, that we need in order to tackle this threat and continue to live on this planet. So that's the thing that bothers me about this crisis. There are other aspects of it I could talk to you all night about. This is all about weapons sales. Let me give you an example. Ukraine was the 4th or 5th biggest weapons merchant in the world. Well, look what both Moscow and Washington, the top two, have done to that. Now Ukraine is selling all of its weapons to itself. The motivations for this conflict are just criminal, absolutely criminal. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Grumman, and a host of other defense contractors, I call them merchants of war, are going to make a fortune off this. And that's the reason we're having this conflict. That's the reason we started spreading NATO out, so we could sell arms to more and more countries. This is utter insanity. And yet we're practicing it. We've been practicing it since the end of the Cold War, in particularly badly. And I don't see any end to it unless we get enough people like you have assembled here tonight that have generated enough power and enough political oomph to begin to make people take notice of what we're saying and to begin to do something about it. And I'm really proud of those Russians who I got a report today that there are more of them now actually defying the rules that have been set out for them in the ring environment of Moscow. And they're coming out, and they're coming out in other cities too. They are truly brave citizens to do that, because they probably know pretty much what's going to happen to them. So that's the essence of what I have to say. This is all bad, and it's bad in some serious ways that we've never confronted on this planet before. The most alarming of which is the fact that the climate is getting ready to throw us off, and we're doing too little about it, too late. We have all the science, we have all the scientists, we have all the data that we need to begin to do amelioration and adaptation, and to keep us down by mid-century to 2 or under in terms of degree temperature rise. But we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. And that's the biggest challenge we've got in front of us right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence Wilkerson. We're going to speak more with Colonel Wilkerson and with Reiner Braun after we take an action tonight. And we're going to bring back Amar Ahmad from Massachusetts Peace Action to lead us in this Capitol Hill action. So tell us about it, Amar.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you so much. And thank you to our speaker. Thank you again to CODEPINK and MAPPA and everyone here tonight for being here tonight. Colonel Wilkerson just spoke about political power, and we have 400 people on the call right now. That's a significant number of people. And I'm putting in the chat right now a link. People can click to send a message to their member of Congress. We have 400 people here on the chat. If everybody clicks the link, and not only do you send one message to a member of Congress, it goes to both senators and your representative, your congressional representative. So each person who clicks on, they send 3 messages. And there's these mechanisms for war that Congress could use to escalate war right now. So our message to Congress is to not do that, to not escalate war, and to say yes to peace. And thank you again so much to Colonel Wilkerson, Reiner Braun, our speakers, everyone, for very passionate remarks and very important historical context and motivations to this conflict. So thank you, Marcy, and I'll pass it back to you. Marcy, you're muted, Marcy.
So now we're going to do.
Yeah,
now
I
we're
just
gonna
want to
do-
encourage Massachusetts Peace Action, if you can post that link in the chat again, and we can encourage
Here
everybody.
it is right now in the chat.
Okay, excellent. So we're all going to take action, and maybe just to summarize the action is to ask our Congress members to, of course, condemn the Russian invasion, but also to oppose more weapons to Ukraine. We don't see further militarization as an end to this conflict, but rather an escalation, and also opposition to blanket sanctions. Some of us feel that sanctions against the oligarchs are warranted, but certainly these blanket sanctions that will hurt the people, the Russian people who oppose this war, as we're hearing, are not appropriate.
Marcy, can I say one thing really quickly?
Sure.
I used to be on the receiving end of these messages in Congress, and what they look at is how many people send, they look at the raw numbers of how many people send the messages in. So it's really important that as many of us click this message as we can.
Thank you. And I see that Vicky posted done. So thank you, Vicky. Yes, if you can post done in the chat, that will motivate others as well. And we ask that you take this action beyond this call and share it on social media and with your allies and networks as well. Okay, now we're going to go to the Q&A.
Could I add one more comment?
Sure.
Just because you brought it up, and it is such a serious issue. I was on the phone with Ro Khanna's Deputy Chief of Staff, Kate Gould, before we met here. And I had just gotten off the phone with two other individuals who had come back from the Hill on Yemen. It's overshadowed by Ukraine now. No one wants to talk about Yemen. They can't even get a meeting. That's bad. That's really bad, because Yemen hasn't gone away, as you well know.
Right.
So I would just say, make sure you keep that in the forefront too.
Thank you so much. And at this point, I do want to encourage others who are on this call to join our CODEPINK Congress Liaison Group, and Shay can post the link in the chat. We are working to point people in every congressional district, and we have, I don't know, I think about 75 to 100 at this point. We need more. We need more of you to join us in that regard. Okay, so let's have some Q&A, and then I just want to let people know that at the top of the hour, I believe when the State of the Union address is delivered by our president, we will go to that, and we will be joined by the CODEPINK Youth Collective. We have another individual from Europe, from London, Aidan Cross, from the CODEPINK Youth Peace Collective, who will be joining and commenting in the chat and maybe later on what we hear the president say. So Cole, perhaps you'd like to kick off our Q&A.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to take the privilege of the first question, and I'd like to ask Larry and Reiner, if there were a negotiated settlement of this conflict, I don't mean in the ideal world, but in the real world, what would it look like?
You know, Larry, you are first, because I was starting the first round.
You're too kind. I would go back to the Minsk agreement. Well, let me back up for a second. Fyodor Lyubimov, a couple of weeks ago in a webinar with me and a couple of other people, he's a Russian journalist, suggested that we need a new Helsinki Act, the final act, or a Paris Accord. That it's time to alter the architecture of transatlantic security again, for the third time since 1940. And what we ought to shoot for, people think that Helsinki, a lot of my Republican Party anyway, thought the Helsinki Final Act was just a utopian move. Well, it helped Gorbachev with perestroika and glasnost. It had a lot to do with what happened with the thinking and the philosophy of Gorbachev. So I think Fyodor's got something there. We need to have a new security architecture in Europe. Herr Braun mentioned that we need to get rid of NATO and we need to have a different kind of security approach. I don't think that's a road too far. I think we should do that. I think that's the ultimate solution that might get this whole business into a different can where it's not so difficult to deal with on an ongoing basis. But if you're going to solve this present crisis, at least temporarily, so you can begin to do some serious talking, and as both heads of delegation at the IPCC said, get onto the really serious issues, and nuclear weapons is one you need to get on right away. And you need to bring in Israel. You bring in India and Pakistan and China. We don't need these bilateral agreements anymore. We need multilateral nuclear arms control now. If you're going to do this, then you probably need an interim solution that looks something like this. Okay, you've got to hold referenda in the two oblasts that you really covet. And if they vote for autonomy and association with Russia, Kyiv, you've got to accept that. And you know that channel you just carved out down to Odessa, because that's really what the Russian Navy wants. They, you know, the ports in Crimea are not key. The port in Odessa is key. They need that port. They need it for the same reason the Chinese need the -9 line, to have room to get their fleet out in time of conflict. That's the only way the Russian Navy is going to feel comfortable. So that's I think what he's going to wind up doing eventually, in addition to the other things he's doing. So you have to come to some interim solution that recognizes that and says, okay, now let's sit down and talk about it. How long do we let this last? Can it last if the people have voted for it? Should it last if they voted for it? Probably it should. And Ukraine will look a little bit different at the end of the day, but we'll have peace, and we can do things to build this new architecture in Europe where everybody can be a part, Russia included. I remember the halcyon days of 1992 when Colin Powell was so ecstatic that Russia might in the future be a member of the NATO alliance, that the cooperation was so tremendous at that moment, that he was lecturing former Warsaw Pact generals on how they should live in a democracy and this sort of thing. And they were listening to him. And then we just made mistake after mistake after mistake, all basically motivated by money and by who's really running this country now. The oligarchs in this country who are running this country. What a shame.
Reiner, what's your take? Is there a deal possible?
You know, definitely I have not to oppose Larry, you know, but let me underline 2 points. First of all, I think we need a very quick short-term answer. And this is the war must end. And this means ceasefire and bring the troops home. Because, you know, when you are looking to the day-to-day situation and see how the people in Ukraine are suffering under the war, the day-to-day killing, the day-to-day destroying of the country, we have to stop the war. And I'm saying this knowing that Ukraine in the Soviet Union was one of the richest parts of the Soviet Union. Now Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe. It is even poorer than Moldavia. So we have to stop the war and hope that the life of the people will become step to step better, even knowing that a better life in Ukraine absolutely needs to overcome the oligarch dictatorship in Ukraine. But saying this, I absolutely underline what Larry was saying. We need a new European peace architecture. And this means for me, we have to go back to Olaf Palme. We have in some months, we have the 40th anniversary of the first Olaf Palme report, which was the background for the security system in Europe of the 80s and the 90s. And we have to come back to this, to a new Olaf Palme report. And the International Peace Bureau, together with the ITUC, the World Trade Unions, and the Olaf Palme Center, is working on a new Olaf Palme report as the background for a new European peace architecture. And it sets the rules of Olaf Palme. Security is only possible when both sides are secure. This is the background of this report. And we need this because of the situation in Europe and in the world. But we also need this to solve the global problems of the world, above all the climate problem. Can you imagine we will solve the climate problem on the top of wars and rockets? It can only be solved in the period of cooperation, when people and countries are working together. And that is the sense of the new Olaf Palme report. For both, and this is the question to be realistic or not realistic. You know, I'm in favor of Einstein, who said, never be a realist. When you are a realist, you're always on the side of the powerful people of the world. We must be unrealistic. We must ask for what is needed. And needed is a peace process and a disarmament process. And how to get to this in these awful times, I think the only forces we can rely on and I know that it's very difficult, it's a long-term process, are the people on the street in Moscow, in Ukraine, hopefully, and in all countries of the world. So we have to work on a peaceful, worldwide peace coalition of moving, acting people. That is the key point. And then we will find partners. When you have a movement, we will find partners in the parliaments, we will find partners in the churches, in the trade unions, and other societal parts. And this we have to bring together for a new coalition. You know better than me, the Vietnam War was not won in the first round. It was a long-term process. And without the people on the street, it would never happen. So let us go back to this situation and do the best to create such a peace coalition which we need. That is the only alternative. And let me answer two questions shortly, which I saw in the chat. First, neutrality of Ukraine. Yes, that would be a great step forward. That would be a vision, because Ukraine is a country between Europe, in the middle of Europe. And the best way for Ukraine is to be a partner to both sides, to the European Union, to the NATO countries, and to Russia. That is a historical role of Ukraine as a country between the two parts of Europe, but also it's a country between Europe and Eurasia. This makes these countries so important. Look to what Brzezinski was writing in his book. Ukraine is a keystone on one side for weakening Russia, on the other side as a country between Europe and Asia, which can bring together these two continents, these Eurasian continents, in peace and for the developing of both continents. So yes, a neutral Ukraine would be a big step forward. And the same small step would be the Nord Stream 2. You know, I'm personally not very much in favor of the Nord Stream 2 by ecological reasons, because we have to overcome the fossil fuel period, and this includes gas. But now it could be a part for bringing Russia and Europe together, solving the energy problems in Europe. And the energy prices are rising. The poor people cannot pay their energy any longer because the costs are so high. And for this time we need, as a part of a common security process, of a politics of detente, we need also this Nord Stream 2. To overcome Nord Stream 2 means to go to the sun on both sides of Europe, but this is a longer term period. Yes, I'm in favor of Nord Stream 2, and I'm definitely against this stupid, horrible fracking gas from the United States, which on one side is more expensive and on the other side is more destroying the environment. So stop this horrible fracking, and better for a short-term period to have Nord Stream 2 than fracking. That is my answer for the Nord Stream 2. But again, for both, we need a new security architecture in Europe. And this is the key challenge. And this is we have to work on for the next future when we are overcoming this horrible, brutal war.
Yes, hopefully that will be the silver lining, a new security agreement, far more inclusive.
Okay, Medea, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a, if it's all right, I'd like to ask a question. Just in the short term, do you see, either of you, any possibility that Putin will be forced to step aside?
I could say, I see that happening if the oligarchs who are mostly around him to protect him, and whose money, incidentally, is in US banks. I don't know what they're going to do now with the sanctions. We supposedly have frozen their money in those banks, but if you listen to people like Misha Glenny, it's about 2/3 of their fortune is in US banks, and US banks are making lots of money off of it. In fees alone, they're making millions, hundreds of millions. If they get dissatisfied with him, he'll go fast, really fast. That's the reality of the situation. He's riding the tiger, and they're the tiger. They will eat him. Then the question becomes, which one of them becomes the new dictator?
Yeah.
So it's not a solution necessarily. You might get rid of the worst one, but
you know, I have not to add to the question. When big part of the elite want to change the leader, they can change it.
Yeah.
And one part is the oligarchs, and the second part is the army. And, you know, have in mind that there are a lot of victims in the army by this war. We don't know exact the numbers, but they are quite high. And all these dead people are coming home, what brought home. And what are the mothers saying and the fathers? We will even have in Russia a much other climate than now. We have the opposition of the liberal part of the society. We have the opposition of many, many young people. The young generation in Russia is deeply against the war. You know, I had two meetings with students of the Lomonosov University discussing about the war. None of these was in favor of the war. But don't forget, Moscow and the liberal elites are not really Russia. When you go to Russia, to Siberia and many parts of Russia, they are only listening to these horrible TVs in Russia, and they know nothing else. So to change the atmosphere in the whole society, it will be done when people are seeing how horrible is the war, how many victims are in the war, and their own soldiers and officers are the victims. So this will come quite soon. And I absolutely agree, when the oligarchs want to change it, they will change it. But I'm not so sure what will happen then. And be very careful only to demonize Putin. You know, never forget that the Putin of today is not the Putin of 2001, when he was speaking in the German parliament, getting standing ovation for his offer for cooperation solutions in Europe, for a cooperative system from Lisboa till to Vladivostok. And it was the West, it was the NATO countries which said no to this cooperation, which were going to the east and accept more and more countries in NATO, which were militarizing the politics, which were blaming Putin day to day. So the Putin of today, this horrible nationalist, chauvinistic guy, was made to such a guy also by the politics of the NATO countries. So the key point for getting cooperative relations to Russia is to change the politics of our government, that they really go for a policy of common security, for cooperative relations, for integrate Russia in an inclusive European system, and at the end, for overcoming military alliances, above all NATO. I think this is the answer. You know, the new leader of Russia could be even more worse. So be careful that we have to change the politics in our countries for a more peaceful way. That is the only solution for coming to a more peaceful world in this area and maybe in other parts of the world too.
Thank you, Reiner. I just want to remind everybody that we will be watching the State of the Union address. If you want to stay with us, we will be posting comments in the chat and suggestions for tweets. So do stay with us if you can. It's not too late. And we will be joined by the CODEPINK Youth Peace Collective as well. Medea, did you want to ask a question?
No, Cole, go ahead.
Uh-oh, you fool me.
Sorry.
While you're thinking, Cole, let me add something to what Braun just said. We're doing the same thing to Xi Jinping in China. So, you know, this is Act One.
I'd like to ask, you know, a little bit about the military situation. There's Biden has asked for $6.4 billion of aid, a new military appropriation or whatever that's apparently going to be rolled into the continuing resolution or whatever they call the next bill. You know, how much difference will this military aid matter to the outcome of the conflict?
In my view, not very much at all. It'll just intensify and deepen the profound tragedy that it has become and might become even worse. Of course, the Pentagon is salivating over this. They have the best of all possible worlds. They're not in it, as it were, directly, and they are going to get a monstrous plus up in a budget that is already bigger than any budget since 1945. That's how huge their budget is right now. It is so huge, it's polluting the thinking over there. All they think about is more, more, more. So in that sense, it's going to do us irreparable damage if it's not already done it. The all-volunteer force is on its rear end. They can't find enough people to serve in the force. I suspect you're going to have a lot more of that and other people's militaries here shortly. I like what Finland and Sweden and Norway have done or are in the process of doing. They've reintroduced conscription, but their conscripts don't have to go overseas. Only the professional force goes overseas, like went to Libya, for example. Did you know Libya, Norway led the air attacks in Libya? There are some people in Norway who are not very happy about that, but that's what getting closer to NATO will do for you.
You know,
well,
from my point of view,
go ahead, sorry.
From my point of view, the day when the war starts, the military-industrial complex in the United States and in Europe opened many bottles of champagne. This was the best gift they could get.
Crude, don't bury long.
For starting an arms race we never had since 45. We have such an enlargement of military budget in all NATO countries. That is amazing. We have a deep change of that in all NATO countries. So we know what to do, and the way our politics answer to this war is absolutely, on one side, double standards, and on the other side, amid an arms race, which will bring us really much nearer to a big international war. You know, we have in the discussion now to have European nuclear arms under the leadership of France and Germany. We have a discussion now about new drones in Europe. We have the discussion about putting 50 to 100,000 troops to the border of Russia. We have in Germany the discussion of revitalize the job for the army to have an army from 400 or 500,000 people, which we stopped having after the Cold War period. That is the situation. And that makes the world much more unsecure. And that is absolutely the wrong way. So that is the consequences of this war, is a totally other world we are coming in. And this makes the situation so dangerous and so difficult.
Thank you. And I think
you want to ask your question?
I have a question for you, Reiner. Do you think that once the German people start feeling the economic effects of these sanctions, might there be more questioning of following the US?
You know, the conflicts between the United States on one side and Europe on the other side, including Germany, are now a little bit under the carpet by the war. They are not officially discussed, but they will come back because our interests are different. And Europe cannot have for a long term the interest in being in total opposition to Russia. We need the context and the development of Russia because, you know, we have a common history. We have so many common. We need the economic, the political, the ecological, the social relations to Russia. And so this will come back. And for me, the main point is when the people see what are the consequences of the war for the militarization of the society, I'm very sure that we will have even more protests in the future. When the people see what are the ecological consequences of this war, because we don't have any money for the social ecological transformation of our society. We have no war to start fulfilling the obligation of the 2%. I'm not speaking about the 1.5%. For me, the 1.5% discussion is over. We will get this 1.5%. The question is whether we can stop it after the 1.5%. So when people see all these consequences, I'm quite sure that we will have in more countries in Europe much broader movements of all societal forces, not only of the peace forces, in the same direction for the change of politics. That is a consequence. We need a political change in Europe, and hopefully this will start when the people are seeing the consequences of the militarization in Europe.
Thank you very much, Reiner. We have about 5 minutes before the State of the Union address. We ask everybody to stay with us. We'll watch it together. Some have posted in the chat how are Ukrainians supposed to defend themselves if we don't send them weapons?
When you put more oil in the fire, you will not solve the fire. So we have to finish the fire. And this is, we have to come to negotiations, ceasefire, reduction of the arms troop, and not to put more weapons in these fires. Weapons, I know Ukraine more than enough. What the people need is peace, is negotiations for a peace process and for the alternative security structure. Otherwise, we will go even deeper in the war. We will come to a situation where we have Afghanistan in the middle of Europe. And to stop this, we have to go for an alternative political way, and this starts with ceasefire.
I'll take another shot at it and say that Hitler put about 42 divisions in the region that Tito was more or less in charge of by 1943, and Hitler got roundly beaten. And Tito didn't have a lot of weapons. Tito's motto was, yes, they have tanks. They have lots of tanks, and the tanks roll in, but they have to get out of the tanks. And when they do, we're going to kill them. And he did.
Well, I've been reading reports about people in Ukraine giving soldiers the wrong directions, changing street signs, and seeking alternatives to a violent response.
They did that to Hitler's divisions when they flowed through Ukraine headed for Moscow. They have seen a lot of war.
Well, that will be our message, this weekend when we protest this invasion. We also want to protest the expansion of NATO and any sending of arms. We know that the United States is in the process of sending millions of dollars of arms to Ukraine, and Congress, the legislation that we just looked at is for $500 million more in weapons.
Isn't it strange? I mean, just incredibly strange. You get Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate, standing up in the floor of the Senate and saying that he's with the President of the United States for the first time in God knows how long, and what he's with him on is more war.
We have the same in Germany. The opposition is supporting the government, saying, please make more war and buy more weapons.
Yep. It's just astonishing.
Yeah.
Before we lose Reiner, maybe you could tell us a little more about that, like the Green Party in Germany. Many of us are pretty astonished to see their position.
I'm absolutely not astonished. The Green Parties developed themselves during the last 10 years to a party of war. This starts with supporting the Yugoslavian war in 98, 99, and it continues about all the last years. And when you are looking to the decision of the German parliament during the last 15 years, when there were decisions to send troops all around the world, none of these decisions was made without the support of the Green Party. So the Green Party in Germany is, I have to say it is brutal, but I have to say it, is the most war-oriented party in the German parliament. Much more war-oriented than the Social Democrats, and even more war-oriented than the Conservatives. Don't trust and rely on the Green parties. They are nothing else than a liberal war party.
Of course, here they have no power and nobody in Congress, so we don't have to worry about it.
But, we have the discussion not only in Germany, but, we have the Greens in several governments in Europe. And in all these governments, they are supporting the war.
Somebody wrote in the chat, here we call them Democrats.
That's a longer story of how that happened, and it sounds like an interesting story. I'd like to know more about it. But
we can have a long discussion about the development of the Greens from Petra Kelly to today. It is a highly interesting, but also a really horrible story. And it's definitely nothing for 3 o'clock in the night. Otherwise, you cannot sleep any longer.
Well, we just have maybe a minute left. Perhaps you'd each like to say a couple of words about what you would like to see people do on this call.
The only point for me is please go on the streets, mobilize your friends and partners, everyone you can get in touch. We need a really big mass movement of peace activists all around the world, united, and then hopefully we will stop the war and we will come to what we are discussing, to a new peaceful architecture in Europe and hopefully in the whole world.
I think
Colonel
the most,
Wilkerson?
the most effective thing I've seen back here in the last decade, and the only thing I've seen that was effective to the extent that it got a senator or a representative to change his or her mind, was people going to their office 30, 40 at a time and refusing to not be heard, especially constituents, because normally they will not refuse to listen to a constituent, and certainly not 40 of them. I saw FCNL do this and just bombard them from all across the country. They brought people in, they gave them workshops in what to say and how to say it. They put a guide with each group of 6 or 7, and they went to see that senator, that congressman from that place where they were. And so they were their congressman, their senator, and they got to listen. They've got to listen. And if you do it enough, repetitively and in numbers, they can change their minds for self-licking ice cream cone reasons. I want to get reelected.
Thank you so much. Let's all unmute and thank our guests before we go to the State of the Union. Shay, if you can unmute everyone.
Thank you, Herr Braun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Reiner.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.